Well, hello. I'm going to wait just a second for folks to join in, and then I will get started, and we'll kind of go from there. Um, all right, so it looks like some folks are joining in, so welcome. This is sort of a special curator chat. I'm Jarod Kearney. I'm the assistant director and curator here, and I'm just going to be talking a little bit about some of the Christmas traditions that have would have been around during James Monroe's lifetime and during his time of public service. It's interesting. Christmas, as you know, has a very deep history. It goes back many centuries. I'm not going to be talking a lot about the ancient traditions and a lot of sort of the pagan roots that it comes from and that sort of thing, and it's melding over the centuries with Christianity. I'm not going to be talking about that. I'm going to be talking a little bit more specifically about the time period of James Monroe, the early 1800s, which is a fascinating time period for Christmas. And the reason I say that is because, Christmas was really starting to find its voice in the U.S. around the time period of James Monroe's public life, or the early 1800s. It's interesting. Christmas celebrations in James Monroe America, they would have been very different from those we have today, right? Okay, and in fact, Christmas celebrated differently in each part of the young country. Each part would have different different celebrations. For example, Puritan New England celebrations were of any kind were considered sinful in the early years, and therefore Christmas wasn't recognized at all. And we're talking way back. Virginians, however, they marked the holiday with special customs, foods, decorations, that sort of thing. So we're going to just sort of talk a little bit about the time period and about how Christmas sort of solidified itself over the years, and particularly during James Monroe's time period. It's interesting when he was ambassador to France, he would have been exposed to the many cultural and religious customs of the country. Right, the Christmas season, a time with strong traditions, was no exception. A French home decorated in traditional Christmas style would not have been complete without a crochet, is what they called them, or a nativity scene, which depicted the birth of the baby Jesus using small figures called sanctums. In 1803, a festival to promote the sale of sanctums began in Marseille and continued today, actually, as a popular Christmas tradition. It's kind of a neat thing. The Christmas tree became a popular addition to the Christmas celebration, and particularly I will take a little bit of the ancient origins of it, the origins. It's interesting. Here, I'll turn this down just a tad. It is interesting. Christmas. The Christmas tree comes from the ancient Norse traditions. The time of, and they would put it up around the winter solstice around the 21st, and young men would bring in conifer trees inside, and which would represent sort of life, the continuing of life. Because the conifer trees, they don't lose their leaves, right, during the winter, so they are still kind of alive, so that's why it's conifer trees. They bring them inside and burn Yule logs, to get in luck and that sort of thing, and the tradition sort of held over. And in 1806 or 1805, the Christmas, they decorated with artificial roses, apples, and painted hosts. In fact, the apples, of course, were a Christian tie-over to that ancient tradition, which would have celebrated, the Garden of Eden. So you can see there's sort of some crossover, as time went on. But specifically around, James Monroe's time period, the 1800s was a time of solidification for Christmas. And it's really interesting. In 1819, our good friend Washington Irving, he wrote a series of 5 essays in a book, called The Sketch of Geoffrey Crayon, Gent. And so, and this is 1819. This would have been smack in the middle, smack dab in James Monroe's presidency. As we know, James Monroe had a very good a tour that he was going on at the time, which is a whole nother topic. But 1819 was an important year, during the era of good feelings, as they would say. Again, another topic for another time. But Washington Irving he published this book in 1819, and in the essays, the gentleman, of Geoffrey Crayon, he talks about how a wealthy British landowner would have brought his field workers in to the house to celebrate Christmas, which is kind of interesting because he believed it should have been, Washington Irving believed it should have been less of a class thing and it should have been celebrated by all classes. And so we're starting to see that sort of beginning of a universal, welcoming of Christmas in the U.S., a little bit more of a solidification on that matter. That's pretty interesting. And as I was saying, Germans brought in, the Germanic tradition of the trees. But also, Christmas was widely celebrated in different places. But there were some, like the Calvinists, for example, originally had, just flat out banned Christmas. But Episcopalians and the Dutch and the Moravians, our good friend the Moravians, they helped bring in traditions of decoration, decor, and things like that. In fact, there's a great Moravian settlement down in North Carolina in Winston-Salem where you can see a lot of those during Christmas time, during that time. But Christmas as sort of a state thing or sort of a federal holiday wasn't a thing until I think the first state to make Christmas an official state holiday was, believe it or not, our good friends in Louisiana. So Louisiana was the first, and they did it in 1837. So that was a little bit past, just a few years past Monroe's death. Monroe having passed in 1831. But they were the first states to actually do a sort of statewide actual solidification of a Christmas tradition. And the actual federal one didn't come until 1870. So believe it or not, the federal, the actual federal holiday of Christmas didn't come until 1870, although it had been celebrated in various forms and in various ways as I've been talking. Something that's interesting is that Saint Nick. You always hear about Saint Nick, the 4th century, if I'm not mistaken, the 4th century, a saint that Saint Nicholas is based on. It comes from that tradition, but, and again, that's a discussion for a different time period. But in the U.S., again, our good friend Washington Irving in 1809 published a history of New York. Now, I'm talking about New York is important to James Monroe because James Monroe lived his last years in New York City. So, in New York City was a Dutch settlement, right? So Saint Nick was particularly important in New York City. In fact, in the 1809 book that he writes, The History of New York, this is Washington Irving, he talks about Saint Nick actually having he was the patron saint of New York, and that he wore low pants, a low hat, or he wore big pants, a low hat, and he smoked a pipe. That sounds maybe a little familiar, right? And this is 1809, okay? So what happens? Well, it's kind of cool. In 1823, what do we have? We have our good friend Clement Moore, right? Clement Moore publishes that famous poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas. And this is in 1822, or 1823. And the poem, as you might know a little bit more, 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. So he published a poem in 1823 called A Visit from St. Nicholas. And so you're starting to see the modern incarnation of Santa Claus, right? You're starting to see the pipe and the red pants and the jolly and the laughter and all that sort of thing. And that has roots in 1823, was smack dab in the middle of James Monroe's presidency. So it was all happening during the time period of James Monroe. It's again that wonderful New Republic history, that time period that often gets overlooked in the U.S. That is so cool because it's the solidifications of our country and the solidifications of what becomes Christmas. And of course, in James Monroe's time period, what we're looking at with decorations, we're not talking a lot. We're talking very sparse decorations. With holly, ivy, mistletoe, mountain laurel, springs, and they would stuck between panes of glass in the window, right? While larger branches were displayed in large crocks on windowsill or table. Of course, mistletoe was formed into a kissing ball, as they called it, and hung from the ceiling, and we all know where that goes. And they fashioned garlands, which were used to decorate the altar, windows, and doorways of the local church. So you had that tie-in, right? Incense was rather expensive in that sense. So often, dried herbs and scented leaves like bay and rose petals would be strewn on the floor to create a sort of pleasing scent. So there were decorations, okay? When we're talking about Christmas decorations, people wonder, well, were there actually decorations back in the day? And the answer is yes-ish. In other words, there were decorations, but they weren't anywhere what we think of today. We don't have those gigantic battles neighborhoods, trying to form these huge light shows and everything like that, which is as wonderful it is. That wasn't really going on back in James Monroe's time period, but there were decorations in the sense of sparse mistletoe and that sort of thing, and holly and ivy. So if you want to decorate your house in that really solid tradition way, you can do so by doing it with just like hollies and sprigs of greens and things like that. As far as food goes, in James Monroe's Virginia, at least, they celebrated Christmas with balls and lavish feasts. Sometimes, we're talking about upper class. Offerings of creams, jellies, sweet meats, candied fruits, selection of cold meats. But of course, along the coast, oysters were popular, believe it or not, and rabbit and duck were common in rural areas. So you had that. So you did have celebrations. And during James Monroe's time period, they were starting to come together. I will go in a little bit to the New Year's Eve and the ball drop. And I know it's a little bit more of a modern tradition, but I will mention it because the tradition has a tie-in back to James Monroe's time period. And what am I talking about? Well, okay, let me get into it. So, first of all, why does that ball drop in Times Square? Why does it go down? In 1904, the owner of the New York Times, Alfred Ochs, he throws a gigantic party in the recently renamed Times Square to celebrate the headquarters opening. Overnight, Times Square becomes this is 1904, Times Square becomes the bee's knees, okay? So, and in 1907, they had fireworks displays, and at that period, Alfred Ochs decides to lower a 700-pound illuminated ball from the building's flagpole, okay? Why does he do that? What's happening? Well, it actually has traditions back to James Monroe's time period, and that it actually represents a navigation ball, okay? So, and what am I talking about? Well, in 1829, the British Navy started using navigation time balls, they called them, which would drop from the shore so that ships out in the sea could actually see them and navigate to their timing equipment to that time ball. So you would have these time balls dropping down. So it actually started as sort of a Navy chronometer, a synchronization tradition. And that's what that is. And that started in 1829 when James Monroe was still alive. So you have that. So you have that connection to the old school. In fact, the only time that the ball hasn't dropped, as far as we know, was that it was not dropped in 1942 and 1943. Why, you probably guessed, because of the war blackout. So, and then of course in 1972, Dick Clark starts his New Year's Rocking Eve, which is, I think, is going on still today. So, oddly enough, these traditions that you have today with the New Year's Eve actually has connections to a time period back in 1829 when James Monroe was still alive. So, to sort of sum up, back in the day, in James Monroe's time period, it was a time period of solidification of Christmas traditions. You had it in 1819. You had, Washington Irving during James Monroe's presidency. He publishes a series of 5 essays in which he discusses the Christmas tradition and how the classes should come together and that Christmas should become a more widespread and acknowledged holiday. This is in 1819. And in 1809, a little bit earlier, he talks about Saint Nick being the patron saint of New York City, where James Monroe actually spent his last years of life. And in that, he also starts talking about the Saint Nick is having a pipe and big pants and a low hat. Maybe not this particular hat, but he had a low hat. And then, of course, in 1822, Clement Moore, and this is during James Monroe's presidency, Clement Moore publishes his very famous A Visit from Saint Nick, which become, as we know it today, the night before Christmas, which that was really the kickoff. That was really what solidified and started getting the U.S. to really start coming together in their Christmas traditions and forming it into what we see in the modern Christmas. So there you have it. I hope everyone is super safe and healthy, and be careful during these Christmas times, and have a wonderful holiday, and Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night. See you next time.